Hello, everyone. This is Daniele. I'm the Chief Operation Officer of Codemotion, and let me welcome all today to this very first meetup of our series of building performing teams. I'm very happy to welcome you, and for those of you who didn't know yet about Codemotion, I'd like to make a very small presentation of what are we doing. So basically, Codemotion is a platform for online and offline activities that support developers in all their professional growth. We are aiming to create the largest community of developers in the world through our platform, where we are organizing online and offline conferences, webinars, coding challenge, meetup, online meetup like this one, or offline meetups, and hackathon in offline and online versions, and as well learning paths and several other activities that you may find in our magazine with all technical article videos that will help developers to grow up in their learning path. In our platform, there is also a very important section dedicated to tech communities. Each communities can have its own space, organize meetups, engage members, and all developers can also check the calendar and see where and what are the next meetups around Europe, both online and offline. We are organizing 3 big online conferences already planned for autumn. So the first one is from 20 to 22 of October, and it's focused on Northern Europe. The second one, early November, focused in Spain, and the third one is focused in Italy. This meetup is part of a series of appointments to bring you on the first online conference in fall. It will be a series of 5 appointments, but to better explain what is about and who are the guests of the first meetup, I would like to warmly welcome and leave the stage to our master of ceremony, Piergiorgio Niero. Please, Piergiorgio, stage is yours.
All right. Hi, everybody. Let me get my screen shared. I hope you all can see it. Give me a thumb up. Yep, awesome. Well, hi, folks. Hi, everyone. And welcome to the first episode of Building Performing Teams. So engineering leadership is hard, right? As leaders, we want always to drive the best performance and for our products and for our organizations. And this comes with a multitude of responsibilities, a variety of responsibilities, from organizing operations to shaping teams and roles, setting goals, setting and defining development processes, or how do we go about measuring value, and so on and so forth. And today, we are embarking on a journey, as Daniele said, of 5 online panels leading up to the online Codemotion conference in October. And we will unravel all these themes. At each panel, I will be your voice and discuss each topic with a pool of proven technology leaders from different sectors of the industry. Each panel will be 1 hour long-ish. We will try. And it will start with a 30 minutes discussion with a panelist on the theme of that specific event, followed by a Q&A session where I will pick the most voted questions you will ask via Mentimeter, and I will ask them to the panel. Lastly, after the panel, please do stick around, because these amazing folks at Codemotion organize a fantastic virtual networking session to get to know each other better. Now, I've mentioned Mentimeter, so let me run you through what it is and how it works. So every panel is going to be interactive. And by connecting at menti.com, so that that URL over there, with the code 568400, and this is valid just for this panel, I guess, you get to participate to live surveys that will inform the panel, and you will get also to ask and vote the questions that we will address at the end during the Q&A session. But now let's focus on today. Today's panel is has a very catchy title. The Spotify model is dead. Long live the Spotify model. What does that mean? It means that the technology industry is broad and varied, and different teams need to be arranged in different ways to perform at their best. But what team structure work best? And when do they stop working? And as leaders, how do we notice? And in this session, we will expand on these questions and others. And we will hear the challenges that our experienced panelists encountered in their job, in their day-to-day, but while building performing teams and organizations. And we will discuss pros and cons of different approaches. So without further wait, I'm pleased to introduce our fantastic trio of panelists in rigorous infographic order: Daniel Gebler, Kevin Goldsmith, and Alesia Braga. And well, let's start from a brief round of introduction. I would probably start from introducing myself, given that I haven't done it yet. My name is Piergiorgio Niero. You can find me in London or on Twitter at Pigiuz, P-I-G-I-U-Z. I'm head of engineering at SuperAwesome, where I lead a team of 50 kid tech engineers making the internet safer for kids. Now, who wants to start? Well, infographic order, let's say. Daniel, introduce yourself.
Yes, thanks for the introduction. My name is Daniel. I'm CTO of Picnic, which is an online supermarket started in 2015 here in Netherlands and grew since then to a little bit more than 100 cities in the Netherlands and now recently also in Germany. We have here in Amsterdam started with a team of 5 engineers and grown it to nearly 200 engineers. And I'm very happy to be here with all of you guys here and want to share a bit the story of how we grew the team and where this will carry us.
Great. Welcome to this panel. Kevin next.
Yeah, hello, I'm Kevin Goldsmith. I'm actually the CTO at Onfido for only a couple more days, actually. This is my last week at Onfido. So I've been based in London and am back now in the US for pandemic reasons. Prior to Onfido, so I've been at Onfido for a bit over a year. Grew the team there by pretty significantly. Onfido is a online ID verification company, so using computer vision and machine learning to make sure that you are who you say you are by looking at your government documents, looking at you. Prior to this, I've been a CTO at other companies. Probably the reason I'm most applicable for this panel is I was a VP of engineering at Spotify for 3 years, several years ago. So that's probably why I'm a good one for this panel. Thank you.
Great. Welcome to the panel. And Alesia.
All right, so my name is Alesia Braga. I'm a CTO from SmartRecruiters. And at SmartRecruiters, our mission is to connect people to jobs at scale. At SmartRecruiters, I'm responsible not only for engineering, but also for product. So it's kind of a mix of CTO, CPO role. And I have a team about 120 people spread kind of across different time zones from San Francisco to Europe. And you can find me in Berlin. This is where I'm based.
That's great. It's fantastic to have you here, guys. Well, let's dive into what this panel is about. And I would start from the audience. So the question that I would like to ask you is this. I mean, the Spotify model is one of the most known examples in the industry. You see, people are already answering the questions about how to go about structuring a technical organization. So the question for the audience is, well, did you adopt it? What is the model that you have adopted in your organization? Did you go for the Spotify model? Did you pick some elements of it? Did you go for a flavor of matrix organization or something else? Maybe you tried holacracy, or you were one of those. And for the panel, for you folks, when shaping your organizations, have you considered using this model? Well, probably at Spotify, yes. Or did you pick something from it, or did you steer clear from it? Let's answer this question. Kevin, do you want to take it?
Sure. Well, yeah, definitely at Spotify, we use the Spotify model. That's pretty true. When I left Spotify, my first role after I left Spotify was I joined a company called Avo here in Seattle. Avo was interested in the Spotify model, but one of the things I would say is the Spotify model worked very well at Spotify, right? Spotify has a very distinct and unique corporate culture that made that model work very, very well in that environment. When I've seen other companies adopt it wholesale, they try and bolt it onto a different kind of corporate culture, and that usually doesn't work very well, right? Because the core of that Spotify model is this team autonomy, which means you actually have to give the teams autonomy. If you are not willing to give that autonomy to your teams and you try and adopt the Spotify model, it'll completely explode. It doesn't work unless you as an organization are willing to do that. When I left, though, I came to a company had a really good, Avo had a really, really good culture, but it wouldn't have been right for the Spotify model. Even though they were interested in it, it wasn't going to make sense. So what we did is we took ideas from the Spotify model, certain things that work, certain things that wouldn't work in that model, in that environment we didn't use, and kind of built our own thing, but through those ideas. If you look actually at the Spotify model, you'll see that it's really actually a collection of ideas from other places. It's synthesizing ideas that have been done in other places and combining them into something that was unique to Spotify. So, people at Spotify would not tell you to grab one idea completely and implement it. They would say, take this idea from here, whatever makes sense. So since I've left Spotify, in different companies I've been in leadership in, I've never just redone the Spotify model. I've always said, well, this idea worked, let's do that. Or this idea worked, let's do that. But then we're going to do the things that make sense for us.
All right. And what do you guys do at SmartRecruiters?
Oh, it's kind of a best of breed, whatever works, I would say. So I'll second what Kevin is saying. I think Spotify model, it's a known one. It's known to work for Spotify, hence the name. So we have our SmartRecruiters model, I would say. So best of breed we took guilds, right? We called some team squads, but in terms of full autonomy, I wouldn't say we have that, but we have something that works for us. So it's flavors of little bits that help us to optimize for speed of delivery. This is how I would call that. We have one thing that is pretty unique for SmartRecruiters. While every product and engineering organization strive to be agile and ship code as soon as you can, our customers do not want that. So we ship every day, but our customers only get to use that when they decide to use that. And obviously we're building software for customers, so we have to respect their wishes. And I guess this is a bit of a enterprise space model that we have to listen to them and adopt, right? So yeah, that's what we have.
All right. What about Picnic?
So we have been growing over the last years from a relatively small team, just 3, 4, 5 engineers now to 200 engineers. So we went actually through quite a few phases where we reviewed in every single phase, which means for us every 6 to 12 months, what is the most appropriate and what is the most suitable model for us. And we have adopted step-by-step elements from the Spotify model. We have certainly not a literal implementation of the Spotify model. From talking to a few Spotify guys, we also learned that actually even Spotify is not literally implementing the Spotify model. They are pretty close to it. So that is one of the things. What we really liked is the very conceptual thinking about, on the one hand, an organizational pattern around outcome related. So that means squads, tribes, and alliances, which is more kind of the product and the result-driven dimensions. And then there are kind of input or skill-based dimensions like guild and chapters. And this is something which I think what was also mentioned with the Matrix organization is very helpful. If you're looking now to which kind of insights we can take from this, then what we learned is, and what is probably most interesting is, don't scale agile, but descale your organization. So that means on the one hand is you're looking at, everybody should look to how do you scale or how do you build a scalable engineering team, but you need to look also how the rest of the tech organization, how the rest of the organization looks like, and make the rest of the organization, let's say, more Spotify-like. This is one of the things. The second thing is, beside all the kind of organization and process angle, it's very important that you think from what is motivating most the engineers, and motivation is probably the most essential driver for productivity, and autonomy and experiment-driven culture is one of the drivers that really drives if you can be successful with Spotify or not from Spotify. And then it's always in every phase a balance between, on the one hand, alignment and autonomy, or chaos and bureaucracy. And one of the interesting insights that we had is you should be, in many cases, have an organizational model that is slightly disorganized, in the sense is that you are not, if you're well enough organized to your operational scale, then you're more probably over-organized. I will drill down a bit later to this, but this is one of the interesting insights that we had.
All right. And I mean, one of the aspects of this Spotify model is also the split between generalists and specialists to achieve autonomy, probably in the teams. Do you guys use, how do you guys split between, again, generalists and specialists within your teams?
Well, do you mind if I, so there were, that notion is interesting because I don't think we actually really had many generalists at Spotify. And I haven't really I haven't really built generalist organizations, which I've had arguments about with sort of agile purists, that you should be building teams of generalists who can do anything. But actually, you know, when you're looking at building a product for multiple platforms, and you have back end and front end, and it's a consumer facing app, so high UX requirements, you really don't want developers doing design or designers doing Java services, right? You really want people who are very serious about their discipline. So we really very much look for T-shaped people, which meant that, you know, your iOS developer, we actually did eventually set up so iOS developers were able to do some back-end work to support their views and things like that. But generally, we were looking at people who were very deep in their skill set, in the work that they did, and we wanted to take advantage of that. So, you know, there's a cost to that. There's very much a cost to that, and I mean literal financial cost, because that means you, in some ways, have to overstaff a team if it's going to be truly autonomous, meaning you have each of those skills that the team needs represented, and you're not using a generalist model. That was a decision Spotify made very deliberately, rather than have teams be waiting for an iOS developer or the iOS team to be free. Instead, each team had an iOS developer, sometimes two, at least in my organization, because I ran the consumer organization, which meant that, yeah, sometimes you had more people than we definitely had more people than we strictly needed, but that let us go as absolutely fast as we possibly could. So that was the decision around that. And I've used that since. I continue to use that. As I said, there's a cost as far as salary cost to doing that. But if you actually want teams to be independent, truly independent from one another, that is something you have to do, I think.
All right. All right. I see that we have some results on the screen. So it seems that the majority of the audience used elements of the Spotify model, so not the model off the shelf, which is kind of in line with what you guys were saying. So do you find that surprising? Did you expect more people taking the Spotify model and applying it to their organizations?
Well, obviously, by shared comments, I think we didn't expect them to.
Yeah.
We probably have some 3 people from Spotify. Maybe not.
That might be the case. Yeah.
There's at least one I saw in the group, in the participants.
All right.
But I just want to address one thing Daniel said about Spotify not doing the Spotify model. I've heard that a lot. Actually, I would say, the Spotify white paper was written in 2012, right? The Spotify videos that Henrik did were 2015, I think. Tribe to tribe within Spotify, different tribes did it differently. That is actually because the tribes were autonomous, just the way the squads were. So I'd actually say that is very much the Spotify model, which meant when I was there in consumer, the IO tribe had not a tribe lead, but a tribe leadership group that was shared. Leadership was shared amongst like 4 people because they were trying that out. They thought it worked better for them. That's not strictly the Spotify model, but the whole point of that model was that it was very adaptive and very fluid, so that you could be doing different things in different parts of the organization and have it work and still have everything work very well because of this kind of strong autonomy model. I think that's the critical part of it.
I think, Kevin, you have a really good point here, because I think 2 things are happening here. On the one hand, the Spotify model itself has evolved also over time. What it was 2012 and then 15, and also what it is now. And the second one is, it is also not a kind of strict organizational model like other kind of organizational models that are discussed in B-School, but it's more kind of a framework or a kind of a set of principles on how you can organize a tech organization. And in this sense, it looks even inside, let's say in Spotify, but also other organizations, you have different parts that look slightly different. So therefore also the question, if you implement literally the Spotify model, is a little bit kind of a dangerous question, because you have a lot of different flavors that you can implement. So therefore, the question is, how close are you to kind of a black and white literal Spotify implementation, or which kind of adoption do you have?
Yeah, I think one other thing, I want to let us move on, I'm sorry, but one other point I wanted to make is Spotify, it's not like Safe or Less or Rally or one of the other models that's meant to sell to people, right? That people write books and sell you, although people do try and sell you the Spotify model. But it was really something just that the company did and thought it worked well, so told other people about. Spotify could care less whether you do whatever you do. And that's a little bit different from the other kind of scaled agile frameworks. And that's also why I think it is actually much harder to adopt, because it was never made for kind of other companies to use, really. It was just what we were doing and thought other people might be interested in.
All right. This was an extremely insightful first question. Let's move to the second one. So you all worked in companies at different sizes. And how did you go about adapting the organization structure to the different stages of growth? In other words, at what point a specific structure breaks, if it ever breaks? And what should the leader do in order to detect that it breaks? And what should the leader do in order to monitor its health? Daniel, you scaled brilliantly to a gazillion of engineers. Do you want to start in this?
Yes, I can take it. Pietro, maybe this is probably also encouragement for your audience to just vote for this, because
they are already. Look at that.
Excellent, fantastic. So indeed, we scaled in just a couple of years from an engineering team of just a couple of engineers in a garage-like setup here in Amsterdam to a team that is now a couple of hundred engineers. And what we see with you grow so fast that essentially in every 3 to 6 months, you need to reinvent yourself. You need to reorganize yourself. You need to restructure yourself. You need to reflect a bit. Is the structure and org that you currently have still appropriate? And then you need to develop this further. And the challenging part there is even if you do regular reorgs, that it becomes not a drag for your team, but it goes much more fluent so that you can take your entire team with you. So one of the things what we learned, I mentioned this already earlier, is that it is very helpful, and it can be helpful to be slightly disorganized. And disorganized means that the organizational structure, so that means which roles do you have in the team, which processes do you run, how do you interact between business and tech, and which kind of tech stakeholders do you have, that this is slightly disorganized. Because the reason, if you're slightly less organized than you should for the kind of the size of organization or for the size of team that you are, then you have a much more natural way that new leaders or new organizational structures emerge. So one thing what we learned as an example is, if you're building new product teams, that we are not immediately appointing a team lead, but that we have a team where we're setting objectives and KPIs, but we are not appointing a lead, and the leader emerges over time. And that has been becoming a pretty powerful mechanism where the most suitable leader, can be an intern or can be a seasoned engineer, is emerging as the leader of the team. In the same way, also, we are pretty careful in looking at when we are hiring, which kind of role plays experience in the trajectory of an engineer. In many cases, if you want to be if you do really disruptive stuff, it's much better to look for engineers that have a lot of potential instead of a lot of baggage from the perspective of experience. Your concrete question about the monitoring of the teams and how teams are doing during the growth of their spades, we are monitoring the healthiness and the happiness of engineers on a sprint basis, where at the end of the sprint, we are looking at how the team is doing. And then based on the results, we are usually then just suggesting organizational improvements and deciding if we need to go to the next organizational model. And that helps that most organizational structures or reorgs actually emerge from the team itself instead of a kind of top-down approach.
That's thorough. That's thorough. Who wants to follow up on this?
I can go next. I kind of work for different sizes of the companies. I'm a former Googler as well, so that one was big. But looking back in the sense of growing team from, I don't know, 10, 20 engineers, from my experience, there are a couple of breaking points. I think what works for 20 engineers and 10 engineers is not going to work for 40. So like between 20 and 40, there's like some process improvement that you should start looking at. The next breaking point that I saw was about 60 to 70 engineers. So you need a bit more complexity over there. Then about 120. And then I think from 120 to 400, you are good to go. Above 400, you need a bit more complexity. So that's kind of like my rule of thumb in terms of numbers. In the sense of how to keep a healthy organization and monitoring, I think I'm a big fan of OKRs. So ultimately, you cannot build tech in isolation. Then you're just going to end up with software that ultimately is not being used. So when you set up OKRs and use it properly, and then review your results towards certain objectives and align the teams towards one big goal, it's pretty clear when you see which team is either underperforming or which team is not feeling well, right? So you start seeing those breaking points pretty easily. And another component is culture. So any sort of internal NPS, employee NPS, will probably show you pretty good results. And just do it as fast as you can, as often as you can, and react on results soon, because there's obviously is going to be some sort of delay when people start showing their unhappiness with the workplace. So when you get this information directly, you're probably already late. So try to prevent that. So that's kind of my 2 cents.
Yeah, stay ahead of the curve.
I think both Daniel and Alesia said a lot of things I very much agree with. I think there's a few things where I differ. I'm more of a fan of having teams own metrics, primarily metrics that could be tied to core business metrics, and using that as a way to monitor the effectiveness of the team and also give the team the ability to monitor themselves. So if they're moving the dials in the right direction, then that will be very obvious and it will have true business impact. I'm not a fan of OKRs, but to be honest, I've never seen them done very well. I have not worked at Google. I have worked with people who have worked at Google who swear by them. I just have never seen them implemented well. In multiple companies have tried. I agree with Daniel that change is going to be constant in a fast-growing organization. I've also grown multiple organizations from between 20 to 200 some people. So I've seen what that looks like. I think the idea that building the notion of change into the organization, into the culture of the organization, building that notion of fluidity is really an important piece there, because any model you have will need to change as the organization grows. I don't have specific cut points where I would say, oh, at this size, this will work. Because every organization is different and it's going to depend a lot on the people in the team. It's going to depend on the culture of the company. It's going to depend on the product. So I don't really do it that way. Instead, whenever we reach a point where whatever we were doing is really just the beginnings of starting to not work anymore, that's when we start thinking about, okay, well, we see that this is maybe not, we're reaching the end of this model scale. What do we need to change? Can we use this with some changes? Do we need to do something new? And start that conversation early so that by the time you're really starting to feel that friction in however you're organized, you can now have a place to go to, a path to get there. And the other part of that is also a guesstimate, an estimate of how long you think it will work. So you may be doing some model or some structure and it's working, and you're starting to see that it's maybe not working, like stuff is going unowned or there's friction between teams or something. And you say, okay, I think we're reaching the limit here. What should we do next? Do we just change what we're doing, or is that not going to work anymore? Okay, let's do this new thing. How long do we think this will last? And then, so you at least have an idea and you have a way to regularly check in on it and just check your assumptions. So that, I think, is the important piece, is just kind of recognizing, finding ways to recognize when whatever you're doing is starting to not work anymore, build a plan for what you're going to do next, and then have an idea of how long you think it will work. And then bringing in just the notion into your organization that, yeah, change is going to be constant for us. So we just have to learn, that's what we need to build, that resilience within us so that we can change as we need to and continue to evolve. Because if people get really fixated on certain things, certain aspects of the organization, it's going to get harder and harder to change. I would say, having been at like Microsoft and very big companies, when you get to a certain level of scale, it is going to be, it's increasingly harder. So this is really a startup kind of mentality. Eventually you will get to a structure where it gets much harder to do this kind of wholesale change. But the longer you can build that into the organization, the longer you'll have to do that. It gives you a lot of freedom and a lot of flexibility.
All right. I mean, Alesia shared her numbers. Do you guys have that set of breaking points in your experience? Did you I don't know, did you follow the number sequence or something like that in order to look at what will break at the next stage of growth? Or
again,
well,
maybe
I just said I don't do that, so yeah. I don't have numbers.
So numbers by itself in absolute or in isolation are certainly misleading. But what we have seen and what I've seen in organizations is everything until something like 25, 30 engineers, you don't need to think too much about any kind of structure. because they need just objectives and goals, and then and KPIs, and the rest will find its way. And then you need to, between 30 and 50, you need to think the first time about which kind of engineering structure do you want to set up. And then you have the next kind of breaking point, and you mentioned this already with the Dunbar number. So if you're reaching 150, between 150 and 200, where the informal connection between engineers of your team is no longer possible because nobody knows each other. Well, people don't know the rest of the team any longer. And then you need to formalize also all the water cooler stuff that is happening. And there's a lot of more to be said, but these are kind of the two kind of scale levels that you need to keep in mind. And then certainly you have another kind of breaking level with around 1,000 or 1,500, but that is looking to the Q&A that you did here for the organization size, a relatively small group in the chart.
The one thing I will agree with both Alesia and Daniel on is, I think Daniel, you said this well, which is what I say is, when the leader, if you are actually physically co-located, there's a point at which you can't just assume information makes it through the organization, right? So when I, as the leader of the organization, when I can't just stand up on my desk and speak loudly and the entire team hears me, once you get past that size, you actually need a bit more structure. Before that size, it doesn't really matter what you do. It's all going to work anyway, unless you really build some really dumb kind of over process thing, when it's really about communication and how communication spreads, information spreads in the organization.
It's a pretty cool
I guess
rule of thumb.
my numbers came from the perspective that the team is distributed, so there are more breaking points. But if you co-locate it, I agree. Like if you come stand up and have a sort of like all hands where just people gather around someone's desk, that's a different thing.
All right, so let's move to the next point, which is the following question. So when you shape your organization, when you, as a leader, you're shaping your organizations, what are the key points that leaders should optimize for? I mean, I listed a few on the slide, but there might be something else. Alesia, would you lead on this?
I think it highly depended on the size and where you are, where the product is, what's your objective, what's your market. But I think one thing is constant and stable. Or at least for me, it's culture. So that's kind of a binding component of any team that works well, any team that performs. You need to have a common goal. You need to be able to talk about how you get to this goal. You need to have the kind of healthy conflict or feel safe to have this conversation, because this is basically the feedback loop within the team and outside of the team, how you can improve later on, how you can stay flexible, how you can deliver. So for me, I would say culture is always first. And then in general, how you define team delivery and flexibility, right? So it's either delivery or flexibility. And also certain constraints that company might have, or the company is led in a certain way around costs. Like if you can't afford adding more engineers to the team to optimize for speed, great. But if you cannot, then those are your constraints. So it's not something that you potentially change, and it's highly dependent on the business. But I would say culture cannot be understated. In any sort of level where whatever you're building, that always comes first.
All right, thank you. Who wants to go next?
I can pick maybe next one. To be frank, if I see the options here, I wouldn't know exactly which one to pick, because I don't feel that really the key one that I would pick is part of it, and I wouldn't know exactly what it means to optimize for culture or for flexibility, because in essence, a product team should have a mission or a purpose, and you want to optimize on the delivery of the purpose, on the objective that the product team itself has. But I think there are guiding principles if you're setting up teams and if you're setting up team organizations and processes, that you want to take into account, and obviously culture and flexibility and resilience and autonomy are certainly very, very important aspects that are relevant. Maybe to put one more flavor to it, one thing what we learned that especially in at the kind of the middle stage of a startup or a scale up, what becomes very important is if your team grows, is that you need to have a healthy notion of cognitive dissonance. And what this means is, if you have a team where everybody comes from the same school or has the same type of background, that went through the same type of growing up through a similar type of organization, then you will build a very one-dimensional product. And if you want to have a product that appears to a broader audience, that has also the ability to attract new levels of customers, then you need to have some healthy level of cognitive dissonance. Another kind of anti-pattern that I see when companies are organizing their teams is that I see then companies organizing innovation teams. And I have absolutely no clue what an innovation team itself is. Because in essence, innovation team is for me, or has been always for me, either kind of a shared responsibility, or this is something what emerges as part of the objectives of the teams. But innovation by itself is not a meaningful objective of a team or of an organization itself. And then when I'm looking in a team organization, then there is maybe one last aspect that we are taking into account, and this is very similar to the trajectory of Facebook. So Facebook started with this understanding: move fast, break things, and at some point we say move fast, break things, but with stable infrastructure. And I think every company has to think about what is the right moment when they want to still move fast, but need to identify what is their stable or solid foundation that they don't want to compromise in. When we were thinking about this, we are now building a fully robotized automated warehouse. We know that if you have a couple of thousand robots running a big warehouse, this is something where you can think about all kind of agile development methods, but this is a plain simple waterfall type of way of engineering it out, because this needs to work where human and robots are working in a robust manner about each other. On the other hand, if you think about consumer products, then it's more important that you focus on failure recovery instead of failure avoidance. So failure avoidance, like that you put all kind of process or org methods into place to avoid failure. This is something I have never been interested in. What I want is that teams and organizations are actually learning from failures and can quickly recover and become better the next time, instead of preventing failures that happen now, aside, let's say, fatal errors, which you always want to avoid. So this is probably the kind of the key learnings from our side here at Picnic.
For my perspective, I think delivery, what I tell the teams I lead, delivery for me is we're an engineering team, we're research, even when I've led research teams, we exist, our technology teams exist to deliver value to customers. That is first primarily and the main thing. But in order to do that efficiently and to do that well, you need a good culture. You need resilience. You need all these other things. To me, they're all somewhat subservient to delivery, in that if you do them well, they make delivery happen better and more efficiently and faster. I think one thing you're missing here would be diversity is a critical part. I feel strongly about diversity in the teams I build, partially because I've seen diverse teams deliver better. That is where it comes down to it for me. I think if you optimize on flexibility, or you optimize on resilience or costs, you tend to harm delivery. And in the end, that's what we are trying to do. That's what we're building organizations to do, is to create things and to bring them to our customers. So if that's not what's driving us, then I'm not really sure, we can have the best culture. I've been in really amazing culture organizations. I care a lot about it. But for me, it's always that culture enabled a level of delivery that I had been unable to achieve in cultures that were not as strong or not as well thought through. So that's where it always comes down to for me.
Yeah, I agree with all of you that the missing the missing item is diversity. It comes up always when talking with leaders. One thing that strikes me from the results of this survey is that cost and autonomy are literally, they receive the same votes. And earlier, Kevin, you said, well, if you want to have teams that are fully autonomous, you have to spend the bucks. You have to spend some money on it. So what do you guys think about that? Is there any surprise in this ranking?
I've worked in companies that are not autonomy. Microsoft was never an autonomy culture when I was there. I saw incredibly efficient teams in a very top-down kind of environment. Same with other companies I've been in. Autonomy itself is not a driver of delivery. Me personally, I would much rather work in an autonomous team culture than a non-autonomous team culture. But I think optimizing for autonomy without putting, in a strong culture of accountability and things like that to enable autonomy, it in itself is not necessarily going to get you anywhere. I think it has to be married with things like governance or other things like that to make it work. That was certainly the case in the very autonomous team cultures. I think optimizing for cost, some companies just have to. It's just an input that you have because you want to. I think if you are optimizing for cost, you just have to be aware you are not going to build a very efficient. If you're optimizing for cost, it's great for certain companies, but it's not going to be a driver of innovation or those kinds of things. If you want to build an innovative, efficient organization, you need to care about costs. You can't just spend forever. But if you're optimizing for it, you're going to optimize away a lot of things that I think are pretty important if you're trying to build a product. If you're just trying to maintain a product, sure, yeah, optimize for cost. That makes a lot of sense.
All right.
And maybe just building up on what Kevin was saying, if you look to the 9 different criteria, then in essence, the objective should always be delivery of value. And then the other kind of 8 topics are similar to what Kevin was saying. You can split up in support elements or means to achieve delivery, for instance, culture, flexibility, autonomy, resilience, or kind of boundary framework elements like costs, because that is basically somebody will set at some point a budget that you can spend on delivery, and that's set basically a framework for you what you can do. The same in a similar way, also maybe governance aspects. But by itself, I think it's important to separate between what is a primary objective and what is a kind of a means to achieve this objective. And if you think in those terms, then you also optimize for the right for the right things, because you want to optimize for which value can you create for customers. And then you say, in order to deliver more value, I need to create a more resilient organization, or I need to create more autonomous teams. And then you have also a clear line of reasoning or argumentation why autonomy and for instance, the diversity, what you mentioned, Kevin, leads to a better delivery. By the way, diversity is something which has so many flavors and has been so much discussed now. I called it this cognitive dissonance, which is an aspect or flavor of diversity.
All right. So we are at the end of the 3 questions that I had for you. So we covered them all. So and I thank you a lot for unraveling these points. Now we are ready to move to Q&A. So, we already have a question, but it's just one question. So before answering that question, I would say people from home in front of your laptops, please connect to Mentimeter, to menti.com, use that code and submit all the questions that you have in mind, or vote for the questions that were already asked. I would say, let's see, there is 1, there are 2 already with votes. While the audience is asking questions, I would ask you, what if there was one takeaway that you would like the audience to get from this panel, what would that be? Feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Don't get attached to any specific model. Your business and what you're building, it's probably something unique. So what works for others doesn't necessarily work for you. So consult a lot and pick the best of breed.
I totally agree with Alesia. I would add to that, you know, we talk a lot, if you look at like lean product development, this kind of build, measure, test, learn loop. And when you're trying to find product market fit or find new features, look at your own organization in the exact same way. So what you're doing today is probably working. It's probably not going to work forever. Be deliberate and question, like, hey, can we try this? Should we try this? Rather than think that every kind of change needs to be run through some change process or whatever. Build your organization so you can try things, figure out what works well in this part of the organization or that part of the organization. When you find things that work well, let teams experiment, and then find ways to distribute that knowledge through the organization. Build that kind of experimentation mindset into your teams as you grow, not just into the product development.
And building up a bit to what both Alesia and Kevin were saying, while there's no perfect model for your organization, or better, you need to find your own model. And pretty efficient way of finding the sweet spot. So what is the best model for you at your current time and your current stage and as an organization in development? We have found again and again that it's efficient if you are deliberate, slightly unorganized or suboptimal organized, such that the kind of the missing piece of the organization, how you want to organize and how you need to organize or set up your organization, emerges from the leaders that are most suitable for the current lifetime of your organization. That can be a very efficient way that you don't need to do it top down, but it becomes more an emerging model from bottom up.
That's great. Look, I see we have already some questions, more than one at least. So I would go from the most voted. I would start from there. So somebody asked us, what model do you recommend instead of the Spotify model for a company that has to scale a lot in the coming year? I don't know what a lot means, by the way. So
I think all three of us have said we don't recommend any specific model. I like what Alesia said around, you know, choose best of breeds from the various things. I think, you know, there's great ideas in the Spotify model. There's great ideas in Less. There's great ideas in, you know, every model. It's the ones that are the most appropriate for your organization, who you are, and then who you want to be. And you have to just be really aware of who you actually are, not who you think you are, and then where you want to go. Taking any model off the shelf is almost never going to work. There's 1,000. The graveyard is littered with 1,000 agile transformations, right? That people just tried to adopt a model wholesale that didn't fit a company. You need to actually think it through what's going to work for your company, and then steal all the great ideas from everywhere you can find them.
And while designing such a model, I think you should be also very honest to yourself and to your teams that you're picking up a model or the elements of a model, taking into account your current size and maybe the next 6 to 12 months. Don't try to build up a model that where you believe that you can live for the next 5 years, because you absolutely just don't know where you will be in a year's time, and most likely there's no model that fits all those kind of different sizes. So just see what is the right model now and next week, next month, and maybe 6 to 12 months down the road, and just work with that.
All right. All right. The next question is, what about the lows you have experienced in your organization with regard to the organizational structure. So probably at what point did your structure break, basically?
Maybe I can take this one. I think in every engineering organization, you have a lot of fun, but it's not always easy. And if you have just fun, then most likely you're not ambitious enough. But the really interesting kind of structural changes that we had was, at some point we had a pretty clear kind of Scrum-like organization where a product owner were running the different products, and we didn't have check and balance between a product owner and the tech lead. So therefore, we had too much weight on the business features in the product teams and had too little focus on the actual technical quality and the architectural aspects of the product teams. So that was the moment where we were setting up teams that had a dual head. On the one hand, the product owner taking more the business side into account, and a tech lead who was taking all the technical aspects into account, and both together formed the owner of the roadmap for the coming months, the months to come. And that helped us to really go from a difficult phase where we had an underrepresentation of tech towards a kind of a balanced tech versus business setup.
I think I can actually point out a couple different examples of where I've been in organizations that have struggled. One being Spotify. I think that autonomous model of teams, as the organization grew, what you saw was the senior product leadership feeling like they had less and less ability to kind of drive larger scale product development. So that Spotify model works really, really well for sort of continuous innovation across a wide variety of teams. It's not great. It's really not great for kind of large step change kind of innovation. That's just not what the model's good at. And you saw over time, you saw as the organization grew, senior product leadership was getting, I think, a little bit frustrated because they wanted to drive these kind of larger efforts. This is where you saw Spotify people several years ago starting to talk more about aligned autonomy, and Spotify trying to figure out how to do that. And I would say if you look at Spotify today, it's actually very different because of that, as the organization continued to grow to where it was. So that was, I think, one of the challenges with the actual Spotify model. In other organizations at Avo, where we adopted not a Spotify model, but an autonomous team model that was influenced in some ways by Spotify. One of the problems I had there was that organization had existed for a long time. It was growing quickly. The old way of structure wasn't working anymore. We were trying to move to this new one. A lot of people were not interested in change and not ready to kind of move to this kind of new structure. And that's one of the things that we broke, was we lost some good people just because they were not interested in going where the organization was going. That's one of these times where you, as a leader of an organization, you have to have a trust that where you're going is going to be better than where you currently are. And so we had to that was part of the problem of that kind of moving to this kind of new culture. But, so that it's certainly, there's places that every organization is going to break, or organizational lows. Those are two examples I've seen. One other thing I'll say about Spotify model is a lot of people assume that the entire company was actually structured that way. That was never the case. Technology worked that way. Finance worked like finance at any other company, and or HR or whatever. And I think some of the companies, like one of the companies that stole the Spotify model, did it wrong, but actually did it better, was Stylight in Munich. They did actually what I would call a better implementation of Spotify than Spotify did, because they made it work in the whole company. And I was really influenced by them when I was doing this in other companies. So that's another thing where that was sort of a low. Whenever the technology organization needed to interface with other parts of the organization at Spotify, like there's always that kind of a disconnect there.
That's great. Let's see. So I will mark this as answered, and let me see. All right. How do you assess how your organizational model and process are working. Survey the team. What metrics or indicators are the most valuable to learning this?
Well, I think we kind of touched base on this while we were talking about how to set up something, right? So I spoke about OKRs, Karen spoke about business KPIs. So I think the answer here is kind of depends. So how I would go about it is I ask my team to define some of the KPIs that they should care about. And this should, they are monitoring the health of it and they're owning them. But at the same time, we do use OKRs to align any progress within the objectives of one particular team or the whole organization to the business results, right? And this is basically how we stay on top of those things, and we review them regularly. We project where we're supposed to be versus where we are right now, how well the goals were defined. And this helps us to kind of understand the health of the organization and if it's working. It's not necessarily only engineering organization, it's overall organization, I would say. It's kind of my answer to this.
All right. Anybody wants to add anything, or should I mark it as answered? My mouse is approaching. My mouse approached. So, all right. What is the most important lesson we can learn from Spotify's mistakes?
What mistakes would those be?
I think Kevin, that's it for you.
I don't know. I don't know.
Kevin has your name on it.
I think the most important lesson you can learn from Spotify's mistakes is that Spotify learned very, very well from their own mistakes. Like that was one of the things that they did very well. Is that like there's a talk I used to give about failure where I talked about running a project, like the largest project Spotify ever done, involving hundreds of engineers, to build a whole bunch of features to launch right before Apple Music launched, because we wanted to do something to kind of push back on Apple and say, you know, this is, we own this space. And those collection of features were an absolute failure. Like it totally didn't work the way we thought it was going to work. And we'd done all the things you tried to do. And the important part of that was, okay, that's like at another company I've been at, that would be a career-ending failure, right? From delivery, we delivered it well, but totally missed the market. Wrong thing, wrong time. Like instead of career-ending the failure for me or my product counterpart, no, it was cool. We just figured out what we did wrong, fixed it, and moved forward. And that is the stuff that is now, you know, that's where podcasts came from. That's where video on the platform came from. There's a whole bunch of features that were part of that large failure that are now driving huge growth for the company. So Spotify was exceptionally good at not blaming on failure, at learning from failure. That was a core sort of defining characteristic of that organization that I've very much learned from. So I think the most important lesson you can learn from Spotify's mistakes is that Spotify learned from them before you ever heard about them, and then got better as an organization because of what they learned. Extremely good learning organization that way. So yeah, but if you're talking about organizationally, it's exactly the same thing. Like we would do dumb stuff like all the time. We did really dumb things sometimes, trying out new ideas. We were just really good at recognizing, yeah, this isn't working, let's stop doing it. And what are we going to do differently next time? We were just extremely good at that. If you can do that, no matter what structure you do, no matter what you do in your organizations, if you can do that well, you will absolutely catapult your organization to a whole nother level of efficiency and delivery and culture and all those good things.
Maybe just to build up on what Kevin was saying, what we see while growing, I think there are two angles that are becoming where taking failures and learning from failures becomes harder. If you grow as an organization, failures have a much bigger impact, at least in absolute terms. So therefore, a failure avoidance becomes a much more natural gene of any form of organization. And you need to work pretty hard and still doing big bets and then going for kind of big results and accepting that things can also not work out. This is one thing. And the other one is obviously learning from failure, where you need to make structural and systematic retrospectives, that you learn not only your own team, but the rest of the organization learns also from failures, that you can actually really become a stronger and a better organization, the team, but also the entire organization. This is something what you really need to institutionalize. This is beyond the kind of the core Spotify model, but this is something what becomes extremely important if you grow beyond, let's say, 100, 150 engineers, where you need to very systematically think about. And that is probably a flavor that any form of agile at scale model needs to have on top of it in order to become a better organization beyond this size.
All right. Thank you. And the clock tells me to move on. So we are approaching the end of this event. But before moving on, I would really like to get a further piece of advice from you folks. So out of the books that you read in your career, what is the one book that helped you to form your ideas as a leader on this topic, or as a leader in general? Do you have anything to share? You want to share with the audience?
Trying to get up on my phone.
Who is ready?
While you're getting on the phone, so there are so many really cool books that you can buy these days, and I'm a little bit kind of a book addict, and I have read probably quite a few of them. But what I really liked is the Lean Startup from Eric Ries, which has a lot of kind of knowledge nuggets and wisdom in it, which form your view on how to build and scale an organization. Then From Zero to One is from Peter Thiel is definitely also a must read. And then most recently also the book by Horowitz, so The Hard Things of the Hard Things, is definitely a good book where you can see if you have to pivot as an organization, where you go really 180 degrees in a complete different directions than what you have done in one day, you can still build something pretty successful. This was one of the most influential books that I have read.
Fantastic.
I've got it now before my phone turns off. This book, Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux. I totally second all those books that Daniel mentioned. Those have been very valuable to me. I'd add this book, Reinventing Organizations. Somebody asked in the Zoom Q&A about that. That talks about a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about, but not only in technology, in completely other industries, which I think it answers a lot of questions of, oh, this is easy for technology, or it's easy for your company, but it's hard for my company, and catalyzes these a lot. I would also add on to that Management 3.0 by Jürgen Appello. I found a really good survey specifically talking about the nature of complex systems as it corresponds to technology teams. There's now a new book on complex systems that's specifically about complex systems that I want to read, but I haven't read it yet, so I can't recommend it. It's on my Kindle.
You?
Well, I have also kind of a lot of books, but like back to classics, right? I mentioned OKR, so obviously Measure What Matters. That's the first book to understand how to align things to whatever you build. The follow-up on that, so I mean, doesn't really, that's kind of a picture, right?
Yep.
Then a follow-up on this that I found really interesting, and it's really short, is The One Thing. So it looks like that. That kind of helps you to focus on things and picking the order. And quite often I find different organizations trying to do everything at once. And this one helps to kind of to explain how do you get there. So kind of explain the process. One thing from Google is like how Google works, building teams around kind of smart creatives. How do you hire for diversity? How do you accommodate those kind of things and try to incorporate them all within? And on the product side, since I'm kind of wearing the product hat as well, escaping the build trap. That's kind of almost like for me, a product Bible, right? So, which helps you to go through the process of organization. Is it either sales-led, or how do you become product-led? What are the challenges in between? How do you deal with business? How do you deal with delivery? How you deal with engineering? So that's kind of my go-to recommend set. If you haven't read that, you probably should. Yeah.
All right, those were a lot of books. Now I have to read for the rest of the year at least. Thanks a lot. Folks, we arrived at the end, and I want to thank you personally a lot for joining this panel. Your insights were extremely valuable to me personally, and I hope to the rest of the audience. Now, this, as I told you at the beginning of the session, this is the first session of a journey of 5 sessions. So today we had Kevin, Alesia, and Daniel talking about the Spotify model and organizational structure as a whole. In the next panel, in the upcoming panel, in 2 weeks' time, on the 6th of July, we will have Anna Shipman, Patrick Kwa, and Omosolo Tunde discussing the multiple phases of technical leadership. So please tune in and actually zoom in if we, if I may. And I hope you will be with me in that stepstone towards the grand finale at the online Codemotion conference in October. And if you want to stick around, I actually would encourage you to stick around for a networking session using the icebreaker link that is on display right now. So it's a bit.ly link, so bit.ly/Codemotion EU Meetup 1. That networking time is going to be a one-to-one networking session between all the members of the audience. So please stick around, get to know each other, and yeah, see you there. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. It was great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Did we stop?
Yeah.
It was great. Thank you. It was